Thank you very much for joining me, Uda.
Well, thank you for having me, Matt.
I'm talking to Ute Heggen, who wrote In the Curated Woods, True Tales from a Grass Widow, which is a terrific book. I can't recommend it highly enough. You have written just a terrific memoir. It is, for me, important to have these testimonials in text from trans widows, because there's going to come a time when historians are reading backwards. I know this because I'm a historian. And when they're reading backwards, they're going to look for primary sources, people who had the experience, and you've had the experience of being a trans widow. You are conscious of your own history in the memoir. That's what the memoir is.
Mhm.
And I feel like it fits on a historical um, uh, bibliography, is my feeling after reading it. So I just want to ask you about your process in writing it and how much you had in mind. I am writing my own history for history.
Yes, it's a very interesting question. Thank you. And thank you so much for the compliments on the book. I really did work hard. It was blood, sweat, and tears to write and rewrite. It went through many, many drafts, and I did literally shed many tears as I was remembering, and I started remembering things that I had forgotten. And I am at this point where I'm saying, as I am living in my after turning 67, I'm saying, wow, maybe some caregiver of mine, if I start getting forgetful, if I'm lucky 25, 30 years from now, then perhaps they will read it to me and I will remember my life. Much what I did with my own mother when she was in her late 90s. She lived to be 100, and I would remind her about certain stories, and there were details that she had forgotten, and then I would sort of feed her the things I remembered, and then she would go off into some other piece of it that I hadn't heard. And so that living long enough to think back to 30 years, 40 years ago, something like that, and having a completely different perspective on it. I thought of myself as being the only one back in 1992 when I found my then husband's cross-dressing diaries. I didn't, I had met someone who considered himself to be yearning to be a woman. Um, and a few years before when I was in college. But the surgeries were not common at the time. It wasn't the cult that it has grown to be. And um, at a certain point, I said, I have been actually thinking for decades that I wanted to tell my children more about what was going on behind the scenes during their early childhoods. Because in 1992, when I found those three sketchbooks filled with Nettie's distinctive scrawl about his cross-dressing activities and all of his ruminations about what name should he take and um, all of this project, right? Uh, I I was just I was just completely flummoxed. Our children were 1 and 4. I was still breastfeeding our 1-year-old. And so this was 1992. I was well aware of the AIDS epidemic in um, during the 1980s because I had been a professional dancer and several of my favorite male technique teachers died of AIDS. And it suddenly dawned on me. I don't think I put this in the book. It suddenly dawned on me I have to get tested for AIDS because actually I don't know what he's been doing. And I'm nursing our younger child. So, um, the import of all of this and the fact that he knew I was nursing our baby and he knew what he was going out and doing when he was dressing up. And he willfully was not thinking about whether um, continuing our intimacy could be putting even our young baby in danger for AIDS that might be transferred through my breast milk. I'm not sure what they're saying about that transfer now, but you know, I think when that dawned on me, probably a week or so after the discovery, um, I I think I had an unconscious realization that his thought process is becoming quite flawed.
You have remembered differently from him because what happens in this case every time is that the person will who is afflicted with this dysphoria, as they call it, what they will do is reconstruct the past, right?
Yes.
Rather like a religious conversion.
Yes, and as a matter of fact, um, I just heard the word retcon uh, maybe a little over a year ago. And then when you're starting to get some language that describes what's going on, um, my understanding is retcon is where you are reconstructing the past to fit this new narrative.
Yes,
And
correct.
yeah, and so um and it was for me a shockingly new narrative because I was 18 and he was 20 when we met. We were both in college. I had just started college. We met at a group that was called International Folk Dancing, and we were both pretty skilled dancers and fell into being each other's partners for the couple dancing that they did. They did Scandinavian and all kinds of um genres of dancing, and I had started doing modern dance and ballet and all just all different kinds, whatever was available to me since I had been 14. So I had been seriously dancing various genres for 4 years. Discovered this guy that I thought was a cool guy who was just 2 years older than me, who taught and helped lead this dance group on the campus. And what he said about his father, as I was getting to know him romantically, what he said about his father was that he hated him and that his father had been physically abusive to him from his earliest memory. He never said anything about putting on his sister's dresses. That came out after the 1992 diary discovery when he had already sort of gone into this retcon of his childhood with this character whom I call Ruth the Charlatan in my memoir, In the Curated Woods, True Tales from a Grass Widow. Um, she, I call her a charlatan because, as in a surprising amount of cases, there are these groomers who are, somewhere in the cult leadership hierarchy who have no degrees in psychology or psychiatry, no MSW, no therapy credentials, but this field started so ad hoc where people with a psychiatric illness lead each other into the pink mist. Uh, and so she was this completely uncredentialed person was taking cash in a rather well-appointed studio on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. I did go there once, a couple of years later, um, to tell her, you need to hear it from me, the marriage is over. But uh, the retcon piece of this is is so bloated and so overgrown and blown up that uh, in a 45-minute session where I'm trying to, communicate my concerns about our young children who by then were, 4 and 7, she was like, without ever having met me before, she was retconning my whole marriage. She was telling me upon a first meeting that I need to realize I have a lesbian tendency. And don't I realize this? And which is he had been bringing home these little threads and tidbits and um, uh, fractured fairy tale ideas um, to me. And I was like, no. No. And what I ended up telling Ruth the charlatan was, by that time, I had to stop dancing because I have some injuries with my feet. I'm a normal civilian, but I can't jump. Um, and what I said to her is, look, I danced very seriously for 14 years and was in technique classes with dancers from some of the major New York City modern dance companies, as well as certain ballet dancers who wanted a more modern style in their repertoire. And so these are some of the most beautiful women. Dance is dominated by women. And there, I was there in the studio, in the shower afterward, in the locker room, in rehearsals, all of these environments within the dance world, and I never once said to myself, maybe I'm attracted to some of these women who, from my point of view as a former professional dancer, they are, you know, the most beautiful women in the world. I admired any dancer, male or female, who, was well developed in their craft and molded their body to develop the craft. But I really wasn't ever attracted sexually to females. I'm just a regular old heterosexual. And um and so I had a window into how outrageous it all is way back uh in the early to middle 1990s. And the thing is, my attorneys during the divorce and my friends and even a couple of different therapists that I tried out at the time for support all acted like, I don't really know much about this. I don't know exactly how to help you. There was one therapist that I went to at the Lesbian and Gay Resource Center on 13th Street in Manhattan, which I think has become all taken over by the trans now. But I went for consultation in 1992 3 times. And, they gave me 3 free consultations. And she was, an open lesbian and was a PhD therapist. And uh, she identified the narcissism way back in 1992. Um, Now, in the field of therapy, there was a time when I was feeling, this was back in 2017 when I moved to my house and my woods, and I was a little bit overwhelmed with how much poison ivy there was out here and how many renovations I had to do and plumbing emergencies I had after I bought the house, kind of classic story. So I um, looked into getting some therapy for myself and tried to explain some of the trauma from my past and stuff. And I came up against in this current time these therapists who just correct you. They jump in and correct you and do this political thing and say, well, you need to say your ex-wife. And she's a woman, and this is, now we know this, and you of all people should da 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 da. I'm proud of myself because I said, okay, I'm not hiring you. I'm the person who seeks the help. And the help that you are describing to me is brainwashing. And I'm not going to pay for this or spend my time on this. Um, so that's a whole big piece. The entire field of psychology in their thread covering so-called gender um, is rife with mistakes. I think, and then of course when they're pushing these kids and adults actually on a fast track to the surgeries because of the indoctrinated belief that you have to hurry up now because they retcon this person's whole previous life. Your whole previous life has been a lie. And we need to get you ready to do things to your body which have very high risk of harm in reality. We need to get you ready to do this so that you won't be wasting any more of your life.
Well, that's actually terrific. I had intended to ask you about Ruth the Charlatan as an archetype because um, the way that you sort of set her up in kind of the middle of the book, and you don't dwell on her a lot, but she's there, and you explain her role in all this. And she's very interesting to me because she represents this sort of cult guru type figure that
Mhm.
existed before the fad, before
Oh yeah,
2015, before the
right.
moment when it all coalesced. And that's something historians do need to realize. They need to know about that. So you set out to write a memoir because, as they say, truth is the first defense against tyranny, or memory is the first defense against tyranny.
Mhm.
And so you wanted to write down your true memories, and in that process, what you ended up doing is writing a very naturalistic book. There are these evocative scenes where you are trying to capture photographs, and photography is so frustrating outdoors. You can't control the light. The light is always changing, and you talk about that. The light is always changing in your book.
Yes.
Um, and that's a very interesting thing that you built in there. Can you just talk about the sort of naturalistic ethos that you have in this book and why you would choose the term grass widow instead of trans widow?
I was nervous to say trans widow when I was in the process of publishing my book 2 years ago, mostly because uh, Abigail Schreier was in the process of appearing in various places about her book, Irreversible Damage, covering the phenomenon of especially teen girls who fall into this rabbit hole or are groomed and sucked into this rabbit hole of cross-sex ideation. And uh, I saw how there were efforts to cancel her, and I saw the word trans as having uh, a certain negative value, I guess. And so, um, based on some books that took place in Europe, or yeah, in Europe mostly, like Eastern Europe, I came across the term grass widow. And I've looked it up. And its earliest citation is 1528 in letters that are between Christian clergy, ministers, I think somewhere in Germany, if memory serves correctly. And um, it was attesting that a grass widow is an honorable woman, not a uh, whatever word they would have used for prostitute, not a fallen woman, um, but is a woman who lives separately from her husband, though it is known that her husband is alive. And um, it's also a reference to the fact that there's no grave to mourn at. And for me, I felt that that was quite evocative because there is this sort of death cult language in uh, the gender ideation world um, of dead name and the attempted erasure at the past life, the rejection of the given name, all these kind of things. And so I've, my ex-husband, whom I call Nettie in the book, a pen name, um, uh, he, wouldn't have anything to do with the old pictures of him as a father holding a little baby or, anything from his past where he's obviously a boy. And so I realized that my husband is no more. It's as if he's dead, except this really aggressive fake woman has come in his place and claims to be a mother and did such egregious things as submitting official forms to the schools every last year until our younger son was in his senior year of high school. He submitted forms omitting me as if he was a single mom. And I think it's possible that because of our case, New York City public schools, probably other things too, like gay couples and stuff, but when my children first started, pre-K and kindergarten, the forms um, would say mother and father. And uh, so he crossed off father and wrote other parent and put my name on that line, and he put his name on the line for mother. And see, I actually had it written into the divorce. At the time, our divorce was finally in 1997. And or maybe it was early 1998, probably January of 1998. And the judge did write in that only Ute Heggen, which of course is a pen name. So of course in the divorce papers it said my name, but he wrote in that only Ute Heggen is to be identified as the mother of these two boys. And Nettie immediately violated that. So my use of the term grass widow in the title of my book, it was mostly because I was afraid if I said trans widow, that someone, even in this middle of the road publishing company, might prevent my book from getting published. And I know that there has been some response to Amazon and Barnes and Noble from people who call themselves the opposite sex. But they do such dumb criticisms. They criticize how shoddy the book is, and which reveals they haven't, like, physically, which it actually, they did a good job of reproducing all my color photographs, 50 nature photographs and stuff. Um, and so the book for a self-publish is actually quite high quality. And of course, there's an ebook also. You can read it on Kindle. Um, and I don't think I wrote this exactly in the book, but as I think about it, there is a turn of phrase which we say when we look back on something and we see it differently. It is, well, now I look upon that in a different light. And I accept the fleetingness of the light as a photographer. Um, and one of the things that I say, just as an aside here, to anyone who contacts me who is a trans widow, I always recommend getting a good camera and um, spending time in nature, just attempting to catch some striking moments out in whatever kind of light effects you're having. And I've had so many times, and I think I did write about this in the book, I've had so many times when um, I was working out in the woods, um, and I don't like to have I got a pretty kind of big traditional sized and weight camera, although it's a digital camera to do my nature photographs, and I don't like to, have it around with me when I'm out there with the spade and the rake and this kind of thing. But so I will run back into the house and get my camera and make sure the battery's charged and all this stuff, and then I'll run back to that place where I saw a certain shadow or where uh there was some lovely effect or a flower just opening, whatever. And then when I get out there, the light has changed. And that moment for the picture is gone. And I have become, I'm proud to say, quite accepting of that. And that may be, in some ways, a metaphor for my acceptance now in my older life of what my past was, what all those moments were. They were each moment, each painful moment, each tear that I shed, each time I was comforting my very traumatized boys, um, those moments pass too, just like the moment when the light you wanted disappears outside. And um, I guess I have a specific ethos about my little 2.78 acres here because I am very slowly and methodically and strenuously and gruelingly working to reestablish native flowering plants, particularly, and eradicate some of the invasive non-natives from my woods because you restore the wildlife balance when you do that. Um, Butterflies and insects need the flowers during the entire growing season. So my flower gardens are very important then for the insects, for the butterflies, and for the birds that eat the insects, for the birds of prey that eat the birds and the squirrels. That whole balance, I'm seeing that I, one woman, am changing. And part of that is simply my cultivation of the American wildflower, violets. Violets are the larval food, meaning the caterpillars eat it, of the great spangled fritillary butterfly. The great spangled fritillary does not migrate. So it doesn't experience the same vicissitudes of the big migration, say, of the monarchs, which are now on the endangered list. And it happens that violets are edible and sweet, and all the woodchucks and the deer like them. And so I can only grow enough of them to help the caterpillars of the great spangled fritillary if I grow violets within some fenced off areas. And I'm doing all sorts of little ad hoc fencing throughout the woods. Um, because otherwise the violets just get eaten down to a nub and they're not there for the caterpillars. And I'm happy to say, oh, and during the winter, the caterpillars in the larval stage are burrowing under rocks and the leaf litter on the ground and surviving overwintering in that form. And I've never seen the chrysalids. I'm gonna poke around and see if I can uncloak that. That will be a magic moment if I do. But then they make their chrysalids and they emerge starting in early June. And I have increased my sightings of the great spangled fritillaries, I believe, through growing their larval food, the butterflies, and providing the nectar through sort of traditional flower gardens. I have increased them more than tenfold, my sightings. And so I'm looking forward to this next season because now I have so many violets. Violets are very easy to cultivate if you protect them from the deer and the woodchucks.
I really appreciate that answer because the sort of structure of the book is naturalistic. It follows the seasons. It is a passage of time and a maturation going on. And so I found it very interesting that you had these wonderful sort of biological metaphors built into it, and environmental metaphors and artistic metaphors. And I really enjoyed that about the book. And you have, I understand, been collating the experiences of other trans widows. And it's important that somebody does that. I'm reminded, for example, of a woman named Sotian Marching, who put together the first English language anthology of survivor accounts from the Indonesian genocide, women survivors of the
Oh,
genocide. So, it's like when I'm a historian researching the Indonesian genocide, I want to read those accounts. It's in my bibliography. So that's why it feels like something that belongs in a bibliography. And also, you have been putting this together. You've been talking to these women. What does your data set reveal? And for example, does it reveal that you are usual or unusual in different ways? I mean, what have you learned from your sample set?
yes. Well, I developed a trans widow survey, which I call 20 questions to ask a trans widow. And I just wanted something sort of catchy that I could use on my own channel, which is on YouTube, Transwidow Ute Heggen. And I also put things out on my WordPress blog, which uses the grass widow. It's uteheggengrasswidow.wordpress.com. Uh, as I was going through the process of editing, I had already written for my 9 months of sort of autobiography that I wanted to do, and then I finished it, I think, in June, and it was editing, and then a few people contacted me. They just were a friend of a friend or somehow heard of my WordPress blog because I hadn't yet started my channel, but I decided um, we need to have some information collected on us because we are a group. We have a cohort. I really thought uh, that I was in this very rare and unusual position, and that I wouldn't find another person, maybe even in my state, who has been through this experience or something like that, based on the false narrative that this is so rare, and so it doesn't really destroy families. It doesn't do anything uh, negative to society. And I realized that the only thing I could find was some obscure person's master's degree study that showed that of the 17 women included in their cohort, half of them decided to stay with their husbands, and there wasn't really any exploration of the real trauma and the real effects of a husband who is claiming that he is a woman. Um, and I realized specifically that the specific realization that put me into the mode of making up a survey and saying, okay, what do I want to know, was realizing that I'm not the only one whose ex-husband claims that the children need to call him some version of mama, mommy, mom. And typically what I've understood from particularly the West Coast transwidows is that this is de rigueur. And I would, if I was out there and half my age right now, and going through this particular kind of divorce, what I would be relegated to is Mama Uta, and my ex-husband Nettie would be called Mama Nettie. That's actually pretty common. And so there were these women really seeking some kind of comfort, some kind of voice. I discovered the website transwidowsvoices.com, which is um, originated in the UK, and she has some short testimonies. And I just realized that those testimonies um, just touch the surface of the information that should be available to historians. And um, I would even pose the idea that, the field of psychology doesn't want any historians because, the histories that are going to be most written about are going to be the mistakes that they made. As Dr. Stephen B. Levine, who was a formerly affirming psychiatrist, but then had some patients of his that he had recommended for surgery come back to him, 7 months later, 17 years later, 30 years later, and say, I'm detransitioning. I wish I hadn't done this. I wish I hadn't gotten the letter from you, so on and so on. And he calls it a medical misadventure, which I think is a bit of a euphemism. And so what I did was I put together, the other thing that I realized is that we trans widows have a great deal of difficulty even putting into chronological order what happened and how things evolved after either the discovery or the husband's revelation. So I'll just quickly read the 20 questions. Was his cross-dressing a revelation or your discovery? Did he then tell you it's under control and not frequent, but then it escalated out of control? Did he select a therapist? This is number 3. Did that therapist or he claim that the marriage is now a lesbian relationship? Did he do something involving secretly spending money? Or incur credit card debt for the spending on electrolysis and clothing and shoes and accessories, and it's a pretty expensive project. 5, did he wear your clothing or makeup? And 6, very crucial, did he suggest or coerce or cajole you into sex role play? Did a therapist That's number 7 is, did a therapist suggest sex role play that you need to do while you are the long-suffering wife trying to keep your family together? Um, 8 is, did he defame or vilify you in affidavits in court or in social media or to your social group contacts? 9, did he claim to any therapist or group of friends or publicly that you abused him verbally or physically? 10, did he attack you physically? 11, did he force unwanted sex with you? 12, did you live below the poverty line? 13, did any members of the clergy, such as priests, rabbis, or ministers, suggest that you have to give in to his requests to keep your family or marriage together? 14, did anyone, a therapist, friend, husband, or family member, suggest that you are now obligated to, in quotes, share Mother's Day? 15, in your own therapy or in the process of interviewing a therapist for yourself, did any mental health professionals tell you he's to be referred to as female, your wife, her, etc.? 16, did you lose a set of friends? And 17, did he start self-identifying as mother of the children that he fathered or was stepfather of? I had to add the stepfather thing when there was a stepfather who did this. 18, did he suggest or insist that the children call him mama something or some other version of mum? 19, did a therapist or friends or relatives tell you that your rejection of him and ending this relationship, in quotes, caused him to decide to live as a female full-time? I had to ask that because that claim was made in a sworn affidavit in court by the psychologist who gave him the letters to go to Stanford University Medical Center for the purpose of getting all the surgeries in the summer of 1996. Number 20, did he co-opt your experience of childbirth using the details of your labor to convince new friends of his female status and his role as mother? And what's interesting in the replies I've gotten from 57 women so far is the honesty. Uh, uh, 1/3 of us, a little over a third of us, that is 23 of us were sexually assaulted by him. And most typically that is during the time period when the wife is trying to go along with this sex role play stuff. I just flat out said no and said, I'm not going to do this. I think this would be messing with my brain. But what can happen is that due to the fact that he's been watching rather odious sissy hypno porn, that type of thing, he's trying to recreate those scenarios, and then he becomes super aroused and then rapes his wife while he's wearing his lacy whatever. But you see, then the other almost 2/3 of us said, no, that didn't happen to me. Now, it could be uh, because of her refusal to have anything to do with this. Or it could because that in some cases, his sex drive just kind of very much dropped as soon as he went on to estrogen and so on. Then he was much more concerned with his superficial physical appearance and going out, experimenting out in public with the reactions rather than, doing this role play at home. The defamation one is 26 of us. He defamed us to other people or in affidavits in court. My ex claimed in sworn affidavits that I had assaulted him twice, which just wasn't true, and it defies logic because he's 4 inches taller than me and it outweighed me by 15 or 20 pounds. 21 of us say that we lived below the poverty line. In my case, Nettie actually committed financial fraud in court twice to get out of paying child support. He, during the second time, he was actually in an equity contract with this database management tech firm, and the salary information that he presented did not include the fact that he was um, taking a lower salary while he was building equity in the company, and there was a contract whereby at the end of 20 years he would have a majority um, hold in the company. Um, and oh, 24 of us. Uh, so that's somewhere between a third and a half. Lost a set of friends. What shocked me actually was that younger women who are under the age of 35, who are trans widows, and either were in a monogamous relationship where it was a partnership or they were married, um, they were physically assaulted on a much higher rate than those of us who are older. I feel like, you know, if I was going to start over and realized that I would have almost 60 trans widows, responding so far, I would have maybe made separate age categories and a separate category for who has children and who doesn't. There are 36 children in um, in the families of the 57 trans widows. And one tangential piece of information that I've gotten is that of those 36 children, 7 expressed suicidal ideation, seriously enough that they needed some kind of therapy and psychological monitoring. That was including my older son, who said 3 ways that he wanted to kill himself at the age of just before 9, just about 9. And of those 7 who had expressed serious suicidal ideation, 4 of them did attempt suicide and hadn't had to be hospitalized. And in all of these cases, the so-called trans ex-husband would not get involved in any way in the treatment afterwards. And
That's just disturbing.
it's really disturbing. And I think that the other thing that you can assume from this is that none of the psychiatrists or psychologists or therapists who wrote those letters, either for a name change or for getting the surgeries or to the doctors, none of them are privy to this information about the fallout for the family because number one, they don't follow up with even their patients. And so this is just completely within operating in a void of the social ramifications of this entire diagnosis. One thing that I've been saying recently is now that we're hearing quite a bit more about the emergencies, the distended bladder, the sepsis, the liver failure or whatever in these individuals after they've been on rather high doses of opposite sex hormones. What I keep on mentioning is, look, I went to the emergency room with my son for a serious thing that happened, and I've had to go to the emergency room a couple of times myself. And what about, a child who's running a very high fever? You've got this person there who chose to enter into this very medicalized, or I would pose over medicalized state of being that inherently involves emergencies and trips to the emergency room. And it will involve several doctors and many nurses. and how many people with problems that just are a natural, unavoidable part of being a human being on this earth are waiting in the emergency room while the doctors hover over this psychiatrically ill person who was groomed and influenced to go down this path and who was uninformed as to the very real risks of it. Um, and, by the same token, of course, then the children that this man fathered um, are, subject to the constant worry. It's like suddenly your father is in the category of having a heart condition at a rather young age. I mean, I knew one daughter of a cross-sex ideating man, a man who took on a female persona, which are the lengthy involved phrases I use instead of transsexual or transgender. Her father did this in his early 50s. She was a teenager. He and the mother split up. And this was quite a while ago. This happened probably in the late 1980s. And he did have surgeries and was taking hormones. And by his middle 60s, he had gotten cancer and he was dying. And she had said, I actually had found out about her and sought advice from her in the 1990s when my children were going through this. And she said that out in public, she dictated to him about what she was willing to call him. And he was too embarrassed to be called Dad. So he got called Aunt Susie or something. And she said that she was unwilling to call him any version of mother. And he got to hear that from his one and only child in her adulthood. That, you're not going to violate motherhood that way. Now everything has changed, and I do see 2015 as the watershed time. Uh, you know, I do harbor, I mean, mostly I try not to have grudges and I try to use my frequent voyages out into my woods and work outside as relief and reconnection with uh, being human in this world of nature as a relief to, my memories and the trauma. And it's working. I would say I'm actually less traumatized than I used to be, even though I write about this, talk about this, and hear about this every day. So there is hope. That's one message I really want to give. Um, but the expense is something that the people in the, in quotes, gender therapy world are not admitting is the imposition on the family budget. And this is not just with ex-husbands like mine who have already fathered children who are doing this in the midst of, living with a young family. I'm hearing about parents of these teens and young adults who are identifying as an opposite sex persona, and the parents are talking about taking money out of their pension funds to fund whatever it is that's not going to be covered by insurance. I mean, the insurance thing is a whole other kettle of fish because it's putting up all of our costs. And there just is no other medicalization that is in practice and is justified by, say, for example, people who work high up in cabinet posts in the government. There is no other medical treatment, surgeries, taking of various exogenous hormones and or various other kinds of drugs, because usually a whole bunch of other prescriptions come along with it. There is no other ailment which is treated with a completely unfounded, undersourced set of data or studies. Now, the other thing that I pose, and I've said this quite a few times to people like Stella O'Malley and other people, Peter Boghossian, others who will talk about the plight of these kids who make very foolhardy decisions to become part of a political quasi-diagnosis. I have said, don't dismiss trans widows and what we have to say. We are dismissed with the claim that we just have sour grapes. We're just that ex-wife, that divorcee who wants to only talk about herself. What we have to bear witness to is something we experienced, typically in person, of the mental health field, and we have the adult memory of it. And so we can connect the dots and uh, interpret some of the speed, some of the politics in a more nuanced way than these kids who made these choices and were doing essentially what used to be, Dr. Oz Hakim mentions this. He's a MD psychiatrist in the UK who now solely treats detransitioners. But he says that when he was a teenager, he was big into goth and he had a mohawk haircut and he was wearing all this black makeup all over his face. And it was a phase he went through of teenage rebellion. And so the idea that, these kids who are actually just in some kind of teenage rebellion, um, uh, they're making decisions that are irreversible, that can cause them ill health basically for the rest of their lives. And it's coming out now that even puberty blockers, it appears, have irreversible IQ lowering effects on these kids. So,
Yes, with the WPATH files and everything that has preceded that, I mean, we've really hit, I think, a critical mass in
yes,
terms
I hope
of
so.
data on the child sterilizing cult.
Yes. And
And
what I would pose is that we trans widows are not shocked and surprised about the quotes from the doctors and the psychiatrists and the therapists and the psychologists that are in the WPATH files, because we've heard stuff like that in person. We've heard the dismissals of serious issues. We've heard the made up political stuff. And we've been accused of representing far right evangelical Christian points of view and being Bible thumpers. It's all of these things we're familiar with.
so in other words, you've experienced this playbook. It was used first on the trans widow of these men who were calling themselves transvestites or transsexuals. And then, of course, they rebranded themselves as transgender in the 1990s. And you saw that playbook used in the WPATH files. You saw that playbook reenacted in other stories. I'm thinking of all the capture of policy, the NCAA, right, with Leah Thomas, for instance,
Oh,
just to
yes.
raise one
Right.
example. So
Yeah.
what's happening is this erasure. And
Hmm.
I find it that estrangement that you experience and that trans widows experience is part of the erasure that's going on. You're being erased from the history,
Hmm.
right?
Yes.
Um,
Yes. Yes, and you can see in there are certain glamorous, I say glamorous somewhat ironically, couples who appear on the cover who where the wife stayed, and they appear on the cover of the New Yorker or New York Magazine or somewhere else. And um, what I typically see, just like, the famous couple, I guess right now is Stephanie Hayton, the wife, and Debbie/David Hayton, the husband. I see into the back of her eyes where she is still in pain. That's how I see it. She's never going to convince me that she's just fine. And I had an interesting window into uh, the political movement of, we have to admit that some women are just fine with this, and they have tried out, doing sex role play and, putting on something that's a silly imitation of male genitalia and, you know, satisfying their husband's fetish or whatever, which of course Stephanie Hayton says they no longer sleep together. They are a celibate couple. Um, but I had some contact with a group that was called originally Straight Spouses Network. And I was saying a couple of years ago to myself, oh, I wish I had found these people. I probably would have been able to recover better and all this stuff. Well, I don't burden myself with that thought anymore at all because they've now changed their name to Our Path. And I just sort of feel like, okay, the crossover from W path to our path, I see that. And they wanted to interview me. They wanted to do a podcast with me. And here I sent them maybe some excerpts of the book as I was writing it. But then they changed their mind and backtracked and they said, um, I'm too extreme because I say I don't regard any of them as true trans. I don't see this diagnosis as having any kind of validity now that I've delved into the history and now that I know about the uh, child sexual molesters that are adjacent to this and so on. And so I missed out on the opportunity to, advertise my memoir with that group. But they have a lengthy podcast of the Haytons doing an interview, and as is typical of these couples, the man talks for his wife um, and interrupts her. And uh, somehow the woman's response, the emotional fallout for her, is diminished and dismissed.
you write in this book
Mhm.
about sort of defending this property of yours, having to deal with um, unwanted intrusions upon it that were there when you got the property. You have a neighboring cemetery with a groundskeeper, and there's, this sort of dispute over where the fence should be. That's a sort of normal neighborly arrangement. But by the end of the book, you seem to have found a sort of uneasy detente with this guy.
Right.
And of course the deer trying to get in. It's all about
Right. Yes.
boundaries.
Yes, it is.
So
Yes. Yeah, I think that that is symbolic, and I like the word encroachment, and that's the technical word. There were actually 5 encroachments on this very irregularly shaped property. And I am kind of picking and choosing which ones I kind of, live with and just have uh, an acceptance of it. One I had to sign over where my neighbor's driveway is, my next door neighbor, because that's actually 5 feet onto my property. So I had to sign over whatever right of way. I forget what that's called. But the on the west side of the property was a parking lot paved over that they just didn't realize that I'm only the third owner of this house. And the survey had not been done since 1871. So I did take back the parking lot. The woods is the site of a former quarry. So I have all kinds of quarried out rectangular prisms and irregularly shaped rocks. And I decided to throw some money at that problem and have this crew of guys with their sledgehammers. Fortunately, it was kind of downhill. So they rolled these big stones down into what the little um, cemetery on the west of my property had and paved over a parking lot, and I had problems during the shutdowns with kids coming there. It was their little hobbit land. It was their little ring that they could put on and be invisible and smoke pot, and I would find condoms and da da da. And I decided I'm not the maid. And so now it's my sculpture garden. It's really a beautiful feature. And I'm really pretty happy with it. I've got some daffodils and snowdrops coming up there. Um, and uh, and I've had to defend my property, which is very irregularly shaped. You could picture it like a muffin, like the the house, the backyard, and the driveway are sort of like the bottom part of the muffin with straight sides, and then it bulges out in all these funny lines right at the end of the adjoining backyards to the north, and then to the bigger cemetery to the south. And I feel like the word encroachment is so useful when we are describing what these cross-sex identifying men are doing to women's categories. They are encroaching and co-opting our sex. And I think, uh, I, I I'm hoping anyway that I present this kind of calm, mature response to it. That is, look, it just, you're never going to be able to do this. It just so happens that the female genitalia below the belt um, are imbued and connected, interconnected, intertwined with thousands and thousands and thousands of nerve endings that cannot be replicated using any tissue from the male body. And being a person who has had basically 3 major surgeries, one to remove a benign bone tumor, one to remove a fibroid, and then my most recent surgeries, I guess you could count it as 4 surgeries if you count each eye separately. I had cataract surgery, which has now restored my sight. And all of these surgeries that I had, I regard as life-saving and necessary and worth the risk that you are taking on every time you are put under anesthesia. And surgeons in general, in my experience, so I've had, up close and personal contact with 3 major very skilled and well thought of in their field surgeons. And they want to gather as much information from you as is relevant to the surgery that they plan to do on you. I don't see that process happening in terms of uh, sex trait modification surgeries. You might have noticed that I prefer to use often rather longer phrases to more accurately describe this, whatever the phenomenon is. Like I say cross-sex ideation. I say taking on an opposite sex persona. Um, and uh, I really see uh, the cult-like influence of politically motivated people in what I call the cross-sex ideation cult or the cross-sex cult, which I guess everyone else calls trans identification or that kind of thing. This concept that you get two letters from some kind of therapist or mental health practitioner, often they're not particularly credentialed, in order to present to surgeons to say, I want this body part taken off, I want this body part modified, et cetera, et cetera. I just, I can't see how the medical profession can justify this. And then, of course, you go back to the Dutch study by De Vries, Cohen-Ketenis, and Steensma from 2011, and you find out that it's a very small study. They eliminated people that they decided to eliminate. They ended up with only 32 or 33 subjects who reported that they were happy with their bodily modifications only about a year and a half after they were through that process. And that study and those researchers in Holland, in the Netherlands, are the basis for what is known as the Dutch protocols. So that kind of brings us back to the medical malpractice that this lobbying group engaging in a charade that they are a medical entity, which is WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. They cite the Dutch study from 2011 as if it created a so-called medical protocol, which is written in stone, which is now actually self-contradicted as they move into tangential categories such as eunuch and non-binary and other identifications that they're influencing basically teens and children in middle childhood to identify as. It's also this really corrupt partnership between the trans doctors, the gender doctors, and the education system. And so, I use the reports of in-person witness accounts of trans widows who have had direct in-person contact with these so-called gender therapists to further shore up and give weight to the evidence, the body of evidence which is building regarding the ways in which we're influencing children to believe that they were, in quotes, born in the wrong body.
I'm hoping maybe then you can tell us what you see from your perspective of wisdom regarding the so-called gender critical movement, which, I have said for a long time that that term is really overbroad. It just describes everybody who believes in biological reality, and that's going to include a lot of people who disagree with each other. And we've one by one, I've seen other issues come up. There was the invasion of Ukraine, and then there was sort of some of the turfs were on one side of the issue and some were on the other. And slowly then we had October 7th, and then it
Right.
happened again at scale this time. We really noticed there was a lot of interturf fighting.
Hmm.
I had to do some blocking myself on Twitter. And then, here comes Gen Spect. And of course, we don't need to go over the details of what occurred there because they've been exhausted. They've been beaten to death. But what is your take, just your broader take or broader view on the quote unquote gender critical movement, whatever that is? Where are we now?
Yeah. Well, I hope that we're at a point where the recognition of trauma and harm that's been done to trans widows and trans orphans will be recognized. Um, I've been told by some of the people you are referencing that I constantly self-promote and I constantly am talking about trans widows. And I then reply that we've seen it up close and personal. We are the ones who found out why our husband was behaving in these out of control rages when we found out, oh, someone put him on estrogen. And and I am saying no one has been asking us what we've witnessed with us. They will tell us, well, he's going to go through a second adolescence. And it's like, okay, he's 35 years old. Why is he entitled to go through a second adolescence? And I think that first of all, gender critical, just like trans widow is, um, a handy label so that, we don't have to go into lengthy paragraph long explanations of believing in biological reality. I I don't like the word gender with really with any of this, but just like trans, I sort of accept that sometimes it's unavoidable, but I do go into these lengthy uh other descriptive phrases to make it clear. And I feel that that's really necessary to remain grounded in science. And I mean, it doesn't surprise me that the individuals who are in the gender critical sphere have little tiffs and fights with each other, et cetera, et cetera. I've actually been defamed and over criticized, I would say, in from various viewpoints. But I guess at the, if you will, wise old age of 67, I feel like, okay, do I have to be the mother hen with this flock of chicks and get everybody focused on the more important um, goals that we should have of saving the category of women for the purpose of protecting women, exposing the fact that there are um, tangentially involved quite a lot. That is, I mean, too many. Just a few is too many individuals who are actually child sexual molesters and who promote the idea that children can consent to having sexual activities and engage in sexual oriented behavior with an adult or even with other children. And so, I mean, one thing that I just came to accept when I realized there was a gender critical movement, and when I realized that the whole cross-sex ideation world had gotten completely out of hand. When I started my book, for example, I really didn't realize that all this was stuff with the unicorn and the genderbread man and stuff like that was being taught in schools from, the early grades, which I had taught and am now retired from, and as all the way up through high school in some kind of, in high school, it's basically denying biology. And so I think that we've even been subjected to words like biology supremacist and a bunch of, I mean, what you have to recognize is the trans world or the cross-sex ideation cult is rife with extreme pathological narcissism. And these people will always attack you. They will always find some other thread to jump to, like that you are a white supremacist or that you're a Nazi or, all the things that we've seen, for example, the author J.K. Rowling be subjected to. And so I keep on wanting to just nudge people back to the basic concern for children. My older son expressed suicidal ideation as a result of feeling bereft and abandoned, and that his father did not want to be his father. And the WPATH world does not want to accept that that happens. I think my children who still, are estranged from me believe and have been brainwashed that if only I had been more accepting and been able to help them by brainwashing them with this period of their life when their father so-called transitioned, then, they would be so much better. And I think one day that we will all be past this. I mean, look, it took basically generations for diethylstilbestrol to be debunked and for the truth about the harm that it caused to the female fetuses of women who took it when they were pregnant. It took a couple of generations, really, for that to be exposed. The originator of lobotomies for mental illness went to his grave believing that lobotomies were good, even after that was debunked as a treatment. And then, of course, the thalidomide scandal. That also took decades. And to be noted, the thalidomide scandal, thalidomide being a mild sedative that was given widely in Europe after World War II, and was also given to pregnant women for nausea and for morning sickness, and then resulted in terrible, terrible malformations of the baby's limbs. So I do feel, perhaps through presenting this idea, that I, as an older person who's studied some of these other histories of medical malpractice, perhaps I can remind people that we have to just keep our eyes on the children. And, it's a very hard to figure out what to do if someone in your family or someone that you know is going into this rabbit hole. I personally call it the glitter cave because I think it's bigger than a rabbit hole. Um, so I guess I'm in a way not surprised um, by, all the factions in the kind of female world. It's, of the gender critical world. I mean, we gender critical women just don't want men to claim female status for the purpose of being on a sports team or getting into changing spaces, private spaces. We want um, pregnancy, breastfeeding. We want motherhood, to be respected. But I guess I would say, I think that there are a lot of people who don't respect motherhood, you know, in our time. And one of the things that I dealt with early on, after I discovered, what Nettie was doing, and after he, you know, insisted on identifying as female, was there were people, and often it was women, who kind of made me feel like I should self-blame because I had been an at-home mom for 7 years, but prior to his surgeries, etc. And um, I don't accept that. I'm like, I was very happy raising my children. I still hold those memories dear. I feel that they are actually strong men, um, because of the way I was able to keep both hands on the steering wheel. Um, and what I continue to point out um, is the dangers. I point out the dangers. Um, Nettie actually caused a couple of accidents. It happened both times. It was to our older son. And looking back, I think it was because the estrogen made him very distracted. And I mean, this is a serious point that perhaps, think about this in the future, perhaps, if something awful like what happened to my son being dropped and getting an eye injury because Nettie was so inattentive and self-absorbed and narcissistic that he couldn't watch our young child the way every parent should when you are out and about with them. I feel that perhaps we might come to the point with this WPATH files exposés that if a child gets injured like that because the father or the mother, if there's a woman who says she's male, who's given birth, etc., then perhaps, the child who suffered could actually sue the WPATH people because they have been ignoring not only the iatrogenic harm that has been done to the individuals who have gone to WPATH and WPATH affiliated people for the sex trait modifications. There might be, I hope, a building understanding, a growing understanding of the damage done to the trans widows, the trans orphans, and basically the whole rest of society.
Oda, thank you
Yeah.
very much. This has been a fantastic discussion with you. Why don't you go ahead and tell us one more time about your book and where to get it and where to find you?
Yes. On YouTube, My YouTube channel is Transwidow Ute Heggen, and I have several playlists. I have movement playlists with my suggestion of how to reconnect mind and body. I have nature videos, and I have testimonies and my story, etc. That's Transwidow Ute Heggen YouTube channel. And on WordPress, my blog is uteheggengrasswidow.wordpress.com. And my book, my memoir is uh, In the Curated Woods, True Tales from a Grass Widow in soft cover and ebook form, published by iUniverse and available through Barnes and Noble and Amazon and so on, as well as available from iUniverse.com/bookstore. And I wish for everyone to be able to turn your mind towards nature whenever you feel overstressed, whenever you feel old traumas revisiting you, and believe in the capacity of the mind and the soul to heal.
Thank you so much, Uta. You have a great day.
You too.